On the night of April 2006, a security camera at a busy bar in Columbus, Ohio, recorded something that still keeps investigators and armchair detectives up at night. A young man walked back into a crowded bar. He stepped through the doors, passed through the noise and the people, and headed toward the exit. But he never made it outside. 20 years have passed since that night, and no one has been able to explain what happened in those final few minutes. This is the story of Brian Shaffer, a man who walked into a room and simply ceased to exist. Brian Shaffer was 27 years old, and by almost every measure, his life was going exactly as planned. He was studying medicine at Ohio State University, working toward the kind of future that takes years of sacrifice to build. He was smart, friendly, and well-liked by the people around him. His girlfriend, Alexis Wagonor, was devoted to him, and the two of them were planning a spring break trip to Miami. Their bags were basically already packed. But the week leading up to April 1st had been brutal. Exams had piled up, and Brian had spent days buried in textbooks and study sessions. The pressure of medical school is not gentle, and Brian had felt every bit of it. Still, the weekend was finally here. The hard part was almost over. Before heading out that evening, Brian did something small and meaningful. He met his father, Randy Shaffer, for dinner. The two of them sat together and talked about school, about the future, about the weight that comes with trying to become a doctor. It was the kind of quiet, honest conversation that fathers and sons rarely make time for. They didn't know it then, but it would be the last time Randy ever saw his son. After dinner, Brian headed out to meet his friend Clint Florence. The plan was simple: a Friday night out at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, a popular bar located on the second floor of a building on High Street in Columbus. It was the kind of place students went to unwind, loud with music and packed with people looking to shake off the week. The Ugly Tuna Saloon had one way in and one way out for regular guests, an escalator that carried people up to the second floor. Security cameras covered that escalator, along with most of the exits in and around the building. At 1:15 in the morning, those cameras picked up Brian, Clint, and another friend named Meredith Reed riding up the escalator together. All three of them looked relaxed. They were laughing, ready for a good time. The bar was buzzing with the energy of a Friday night crowd, full of people doing exactly what they were doing, blowing off steam. For the next 40 minutes or so, the group moved through the bar like anyone else would. They talked, they drank, they mingled with the crowd. It was a completely ordinary night. Then, at 1:55 in the morning, something happened that would replay in people's minds for decades. Brian stepped out of the bar's main entrance and onto the small exterior landing, a kind of open platform just outside the doors. He wasn't alone. He struck up a casual conversation with two young women he had apparently just met. The security cameras caught all of it clearly. Brian looked relaxed. He was smiling, chatting easily, completely at ease. There was nothing in his body language to suggest that anything was wrong. After a few minutes, the conversation ended naturally. Brian said goodbye to the women, turned around, and walked back through the entrance into the bar. That was the last image anyone has of him. Brian Shaffer, stepping through that doorway and disappearing into the crowd. At 2:30 in the morning, the Ugly Tuna Saloon shut its doors. The music stopped, the lights went up, and the crowd began to funnel down the escalator and out into the cool night air. Clint and Meredith waited on the sidewalk outside, scanning every face that came through. They were sure Brian would show up any second. Maybe he'd gotten talking to someone. Maybe he was one of the last ones out. But the stream of people thinned and then stopped. Brian was not among them. At first, Clint figured his friend had probably slipped out through the service exit, a back entrance that ran through a construction area and led to an alley behind the building. It wasn't impossible, Construction on a nearby addition meant there were some areas of the building that weren't fully monitored. But when police arrived and reviewed the security footage, that theory fell apart. The service exit showed no sign of Brian. Every other exit, every possible way out of that building, was covered by cameras, and not one of them showed Brian walking through. He had entered the bar at 1:55 a.m. The bar closed at 2 a.m., and somewhere in those 5 minutes, he vanished. By Monday morning, it was clear something was very wrong. Brian had missed his flight to Miami without a word. Alexis hadn't heard from him. When his father Randy called the police, the investigation began in earnest. Detectives and searchers combed through every corner of the building and the surrounding area. They went through the construction site with careful attention, looking for any sign that Brian had been there. They searched the Olentangy River, which ran not far from the bar. They went to Brian's apartment and found everything exactly as he had left it. His belongings were there, untouched, as if he had only stepped out for a moment and planned to be right back. His car was still sitting in the parking lot near the bar. His bank accounts showed zero activity, not a single withdrawal, not a single purchase. His phone went unanswered. It was as if Brian Shaffer had simply stopped existing. Months went by with no leads, no sightings, and no explanation. Then, about 5 months after Brian disappeared, Alexis did something that many people do when they miss someone. She called his number. She just wanted to hear his voicemail greeting, the sound of his voice saying something ordinary. But this time, the phone rang. It rang 3 times before going to voicemail. That detail might sound small, but it sent a jolt through everyone connected to the case. A phone that rings is a phone that is on, a phone that has a signal, a phone that is somewhere. Investigators traced the signal to a cell tower located miles away from the bar. They went to the area immediately. They found nothing. Authorities eventually labeled it a technical glitch, a ghost signal, a blip in the system. But for the people who loved Brian, it didn't feel like a glitch. It felt like a door that had opened for just a moment, and then slammed shut. For Randy Shaffer, the investigation wasn't something that could just be handed off to detectives and forgotten. This was his son. So Randy searched himself. For 2 years, he waded through cold river water, walked through fields and wooded areas, and put up flyers with Brian's face on them in every place he could think of. He knocked on doors. He made phone calls. He followed up on every tip, no matter how thin, because the alternative, accepting that his son was simply gone, was not something he was willing to do. Randy held on to the belief that Brian was alive. He had to. It was the only thing that made the searching feel worth it. In 2008, 2 years after Brian disappeared, Randy Shaffer was in his own backyard when a storm blew a tree branch down. It struck him and killed him instantly. Randy died without ever finding out what happened to his son. He never got an answer. He never got closure. He spent the last years of his life searching for a truth that never came. And then he was gone too. It is one of the saddest parts of a story that is already full of sadness. The theories about what happened to Brian Shaffer are as varied as the people who discuss them. Some people believe he left voluntarily, that the stress of medical school, combined with something unknown that happened that night, led him to simply walk away from his life. Under this theory, the construction area offered a brief window without camera coverage, and Brian slipped through it on purpose. He had no history of depression or instability that anyone has pointed to publicly. But people can surprise you. Others believe something happened to him inside the bar or just outside it. That he was harmed by someone. That the construction area provided cover not for an escape but for something darker. Under this theory, someone knows something and has never come forward. There are also people who focus on the phone signal, who believe that ping from miles away was real, that Brian was alive at least for those first few months, and that he chose to stay hidden. No theory has ever been proven. No evidence has ever pointed investigators clearly in one direction. The case remains officially open. Brian's brother Derek is still here. He is the one who carries the question now, the one who has grown older with it, who has lived his whole adult life with the mystery of what happened to his brother on that Friday night in Columbus. Derek has spoken publicly about the case over the years, and his presence is a reminder that missing persons cases don't end when the news stops covering them. Families carry these stories with them forever. They go to bed with the questions and wake up with them. The not knowing becomes part of how they live. The Ugly Tuna Saluna itself has since closed. The building has changed, but the security footage from that night still exists. And that final image, Brian walking back through the bar's entrance at 1:55 in the morning, is still there, still refusing to give up its secret. The cameras didn't malfunction. The exits were covered. The crowd was thick and full of witnesses, and yet somehow Brian Shaffer stepped through a doorway and was gone. He didn't walk out the front. He didn't walk out the back. By every account, by every piece of footage, by every physical piece of evidence investigators have examined over 2 decades, he simply did not come out. How does that happen? How does a person walk into a room in front of dozens of witnesses and never be seen again? That is the question Brian Shaffer's disappearance leaves us with. Not a neatly solved case with a satisfying ending, but a gap. A quiet, unsettling gap where a person used to be. Whatever the truth is, it is out there somewhere. And someone, somewhere, may know exactly what it is.